July 18th, 1944. The morning sun blazed over the wheat fields of Normandy, turning dust into golden haze. In a narrow lane between two hedgerows, Sergeant Curtis Coulin crouched beside his disabled Sherman tank, staring at the massive track marks embedded in the mud. Tiger tank tracks. Fresh. Close. Somewhere beyond the hedge wall, the beast waited. The tiger was hunting, and Coulin knew it. Every American tanker in France knew the statistics by now. One tiger could destroy 4 Shermans before going down, sometimes 5. The German Mark VI carried an 88mm gun that could punch through American armor at ranges where American guns could barely scratch German steel. The math was simple and brutal. In a straight fight, the Sherman lost. Every time. But Cullen was not thinking about straight fights anymore. He was thinking about a piece of scrap steel he had welded to his tank's bow 3 days earlier. A crude contraption fashioned from German beach obstacles, shaped like twin tusks jutting forward. His crew had laughed when he first proposed it. His battalion commander had called it improvised junk. But Coulin had seen something in the hedgerows that no one else had noticed. He had seen a weakness in the land itself. The problem was not just the Tiger tanks, though God knows they were problem enough. The real problem was Normandy's bocage country, a medieval landscape of dense hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress and every lane into a killing ground. The hedgerows stood 12 feet high, thick walls of earth and roots and vegetation that had grown undisturbed for centuries. Tanks could not drive through them. Infantry could not see over them, and the Germans had turned them into a defensive nightmare that was bleeding the Allied advance white. American doctrine had prepared for many things, but not for this. The hedgerows did not appear on the maps with sufficient detail. Intelligence briefings had mentioned them, but underestimated their tactical significance. When the first American tanks tried to bull through the hedge walls in early July, they reared up like bucking horses, exposing their thin belly armor to German gunners waiting on the other side. The result was slaughter. Entire tank platoons burned in the Norman fields. Their crews roasted alive because they had tried to break through obstacles their commanders did not fully understand. The Tiger tanks exploited this terrain with methodical precision. They positioned themselves in fields with clear lines of fire across the narrow lanes between hedgerows. They waited until American Shermans approached, boxed in by the earth walls on either side with no room to maneuver. Then they fired. The 88mm rounds hit at point-blank range, punching through the Sherman's frontal armor like paper. American tankers died without ever seeing their killers. By mid-July 1944, the breakout from Normandy had stalled. Omar Bradley's First Army was grinding forward at terrible cost, measuring gains in yards rather than miles. The casualty rates were approaching those of World War I trench warfare. Something had to change, and change quickly, or the entire invasion would bog down into a war of attrition that America might win eventually, but only after bleeding away an entire generation. Curtis Coulin had grown up on a farm in Kentucky, where obstacles were problems to be solved with available materials and practical thinking. He had no engineering degree, no advanced training in metallurgy or tactics, but he understood leverage and cutting and the way metal could be shaped to accomplish specific tasks. And he had noticed something about the hedgerows that the generals and the intelligence officers had missed. The hedgerows were not solid walls. They were compressed earth held together by centuries of root growth. The roots created a dense mat several feet thick, but beneath that mat, the soil was relatively soft. If you could cut through the root layer, you could drive through the earth behind it. The problem was that tank hulls were smooth. When they tried to climb the hedgerows, they rode up on the root mat and exposed their bellies. What they needed was something to cut through the roots while keeping the tank's nose down. Cullen's solution was almost absurdly simple. He took steel stakes from German beach obstacles that littered the Normandy coast and welded them to the front of his Sherman in a pronged configuration. The prongs would bite into the hedgerow at ground level and hold the tank's nose down while the weight and engine power drove forward. The steel would cut through the root mat like a plow through hard soil. In theory, the tank could punch through hedgerows without rearing up, without exposing its vulnerable underside, and emerge into the next field with guns ready to fire. Theory and practice are separated by the moment of truth, and Colin's moment came on a hot afternoon when his platoon encountered a hedgerow with a Tiger tank waiting on the other side. Intelligence had reported the Tiger's position. The standard procedure would have been to call for air support or artillery and wait. But waiting gave the Tiger time to relocate, time to prepare, time to choose the next killing ground. Colin made a different choice. He aligned his Sherman perpendicular to the hedgerow and opened the throttle. The engine roared. The steel prongs bit into earth and roots. The tank shuddered, lurched, and drove forward. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. The Sherman was blind, pushing through vegetation and dirt with no visibility, no situational awareness, completely vulnerable if the calculations were wrong. Then the tank burst through into the next field. Nose down, gun elevated, and there was the Tiger, positioned broadside 70 yards away, its crew clearly not expecting a Sherman to appear through a solid hedgerow. Colin's gunner fired first. The 75mm round struck the Tiger's side armor, the one place where the Sherman's gun had a chance of penetration. The German tank shuddered but did not brew up. Its turret began to traverse, the 88mm gun swinging toward the Sherman. Colin's gunner fired again, and again. The third round found a weak point in the Tiger's hull. Smoke poured from the German tank's engine compartment. The Tiger's crew bailed out and ran. Word spread through the American ranks like wildfire. Colin had done the impossible. He had killed a Tiger tank in a Sherman by changing the terms of engagement. He had not tried to match the Tiger's armor or firepower. He had simply arrived in a position where the Tiger's advantages did not matter. The hedgerow cutters, as they came to be called, did not make Shermans equal to Tigers in a fair fight. They eliminated the possibility of fair fights entirely. Within days, every American tank unit in Normandy was scavenging German beach obstacles and welding them into hedgerow cutters. Ordnance units set up assembly lines to standardize the design. What had started as one sergeant's improvisation became official doctrine in less than a week. By the end of July, thousands of American tanks carried the steel tusks that transformed them from victims of the bocage into predators capable of attacking from any direction. The tactical implications were revolutionary. German defensive positions that had been anchored on hedgerow choke points suddenly became vulnerable to flanking attacks. Tigers that had dominated the narrow lanes found themselves engaged from unexpected angles. American tank commanders stopped funneling their Shermans into killing grounds and started cutting their own paths through the Norman countryside. The pace of advance accelerated. The breakout began. The psychological impact on German tank crews was profound. They had spent weeks methodically destroying American armor, confident in the superiority of their machines and the defensive strength of the terrain. The Tiger tank was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of German engineering excellence, a manifestation of the idea that quality would always triumph over quantity. Each Tiger represented hundreds of man-hours of precision manufacturing, rare materials, and technical expertise that the Americans could not match. But the Americans had not tried to match it. They had gone around it, through it, under it. They had turned the bocage from a German asset into a German trap. Tiger crews who had felt invincible found themselves caught in fields with American Shermans bursting through hedgerows from multiple directions. The 88mm gun could only aim one direction at a time. Quality meant nothing when quantity arrived from 4 angles simultaneously. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was the steel prong itself, that crude piece of salvaged metal welded onto the front of a tank. It was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It was not the product of advanced engineering or years of research and development. It was a farmer's solution to a farmer's problem, applied by soldiers who understood that surviving the next engagement mattered more than maintaining doctrinal purity. German after-action reports from late July 1944 showed confusion and frustration. Panzer commanders reported that American tanks were appearing in locations that should have been inaccessible. Defensive positions carefully prepared to dominate hedgerow lanes were being bypassed entirely. The terrain that had been Germany's ally was becoming neutral, and without that ally, the mathematics of the Normandy campaign shifted decisively against the defenders. By early August, the German 7th Army was in full retreat. The breakout from Normandy became a breakout across France. American armored divisions raced east, cutting through hedgerows that would have stopped them cold just weeks earlier. The Tiger tanks that remained in Normandy fought desperate rearguard actions, still dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. The myth of invincibility died in the Norman wheat fields, killed not by superior weapons, but by superior adaptability. Curtis Cullen received the Legion of Merit for his innovation. The citation praised his initiative and ingenuity, but it could not quite capture the larger significance of what he had accomplished. He had not invented a new weapon. He had invented a new way of thinking about the problem. And that new way of thinking spread through the American army like a virus, infecting everything it touched. Other soldiers began to improvise. They welded extra armor plates scavenged from destroyed German vehicles onto their Shermans. They modified machine gun mounts for better anti-infantry defense. They developed new tactics for combined arms operations in close terrain. The hedgerow cutters had demonstrated that official solutions were not the only solutions, that battlefield problems could be solved by the soldiers facing those problems if they were given the freedom and resources to experiment. This culture of innovation stood in stark contrast to the German approach. The Wehrmacht was a superb military organization in many ways, but it was not adaptive at the tactical level. German soldiers were trained to execute doctrine with precision. When doctrine failed, they reported the failure up the chain of command and waited for new orders. The idea that a sergeant could fundamentally alter the way tanks operated would have been nearly incomprehensible to the German military culture. American military culture was different. Not because Americans were inherently more creative, but because American society valued individual initiative in ways that authoritarian systems could not replicate. Curtis Cullen had grown up in a democracy where fixing problems was expected and valued. He had been taught to think for himself, to question assumptions, to try solutions that might fail. That cultural foundation translated into tactical flexibility on the battlefield. The hedgerow cutters became a case study taught at military academies for decades afterward. They appeared in training manuals and strategy documents as an example of adaptive innovation under combat conditions. But the lesson was often misunderstood. The lesson was not that soldiers should weld random pieces of metal to their equipment. The lesson was that organizations that empower individuals to solve problems will develop solutions that centralized planning cannot anticipate. The Tiger tank, by contrast, became a cautionary tale. It was a magnificent piece of engineering that embodied a flawed philosophy. The Germans had tried to win through technical superiority, building machines so advanced that they would dominate any battlefield. But technical superiority meant nothing if those machines could be outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and overwhelmed by more adaptable opponents. The Tiger was faster, stronger, and better armed than the Sherman. And it lost anyway. Production numbers told part of the story. Germany built approximately 1,300 Tiger tanks during the entire war. America built over 49,000 Shermans. But raw numbers alone did not explain the outcome. Soviet T-34 tanks also outnumbered Tigers, yet Soviet forces took horrific casualties in tank-versus-tank combat throughout 1943 and 1944. The difference was not just quantity. The difference was adaptability backed by industrial capacity. American forces could afford to experiment because they had the resources to recover from failures. If Cullen's hedgerow cutters had not worked, there would have been other ideas, other attempts, other improvisations. The Sherman tank itself went through dozens of variants and modifications as problems were identified and solutions implemented. The final versions of the Sherman bore little resemblance to the early models beyond basic configuration. Everything else had been improved, adjusted, and refined based on battlefield experience. German industry could not support that kind of iterative development. Every Tiger tank represented an enormous investment of scarce resources. Changing the design meant retooling factories and retraining crews. The Germans had built a military machine that was brilliant but brittle, capable of extraordinary performance under optimal conditions, but unable to adapt when conditions changed. The hedgerow cutters changed the conditions. By September 1944, the German army in France had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Remnants retreated across the Rhine. Equipment was abandoned. Tiger tanks were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. The unstoppable killing machines that had terrified American tankers in July were scrap metal in September, destroyed not primarily in combat but through the collapse of the logistical and tactical systems that made them effective. The symbolic resonance of the hedgerow cutter extended beyond its practical military application. In the broader narrative of World War II, it represented the moment when American industrial democracy proved its worth not through raw power, but through creative adaptation. The Allies would have won the war eventually through sheer material superiority. But the hedgerow cutters shortened the war. They saved lives. They demonstrated that victory came not just from having more, but from using what you had more intelligently. Curtis Cullen returned home to Kentucky after the war and resumed farming. He rarely spoke about his invention, treating it as a practical solution to a practical problem, rather than a historic achievement. When reporters occasionally tracked him down for interviews, he deflected credit to his crew, to the ordnance units that standardized the design, to the other soldiers who had improved and refined the concept. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the attention, but military historians understood what Cullen himself seemed not to fully grasp. The hedgerow cutters had not just been a clever battlefield expedient, they had been a proof of concept for an entire way of war. They had shown that American forces could out-adapt their opponents even when they could not out-engineer them. They had revealed that the strength of democracy was not just its industrial base, but its cultural willingness to trust individuals to solve problems, without waiting for permission from above. WWII, German Tiger tanks that survived the war, became museum pieces, monuments to engineering excellence divorced from strategic wisdom. They were beautiful in their way, massive and powerful and precisely crafted. But they stood silent, immobile, defeated by enemies they should have crushed if warfare were only about technical specifications. The hedgerow cutters, by contrast, were mostly scrapped for metal after the war. Few survive in museums, but their legacy survived in doctrine, in training, in the institutional memory of an army that learned to value adaptability as much as firepower. Years later, military analysts studying the Normandy campaign would identify the hedgerow breakthrough as one of the critical turning points of the European war. Not because it was a dramatic battle, but because it represented the moment when the German army lost its last significant tactical advantage. After the bocage was breached, the path to Germany lay open. The war would continue for 9 more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The steel prongs that had seemed so crude and improvised in July became standard equipment by August. They were refined, standardized, and produced in quantity. But they never lost their essential character as improvised solutions born of necessity. Every time a Sherman pushed through a hedgerow, with the steel tusks cutting through roots and earth, it was a small victory for the idea that problems could be solved with available resources and clear thinking, rather than waiting for perfect solutions from distant authorities. The Tiger crews who survived the Normandy campaign and fought in the later battles of the war never regained the psychological advantage they had possessed in early July. They knew now that their machines were not invincible. They knew that American tankers would not fight fair fights. They knew that the next engagement might come from an impossible direction with impossible speed. That knowledge was corrosive. It turned the Tiger from a source of confidence into a liability, a massive target that attracted every American tank within range. The final Tiger tanks were destroyed in the rubble of German cities in 1945. Still formidable weapons, but surrounded and overwhelmed by enemies who had learned not to fear them. The crews fought with skill and courage, but skill and courage could not overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Germany had lost the war of adaptation. The Wehrmacht had built an army designed to win the war of 1940. It was still fighting that war in 1945, while its enemies had evolved through 5 years of continuous learning and improvement. Curtis Coulin's steel prongs represented that evolution in miniature. They were not the product of brilliant strategic vision or years of research. They were the product of a soldier looking at a problem and asking the most American of questions. How can I fix this with what I have? That question, repeated thousands of times across thousands of battlefields, accumulated into an overwhelming advantage that no amount of technical sophistication could overcome. The truth embedded in that simple piece of welded metal was this: wars are not won by perfect weapons, but by imperfect soldiers given the freedom to solve problems. The Tiger was a better tank than the Sherman by every measurable specification. But specifications measure machines, not systems. And war is a contest between systems: industrial systems, logistical systems, cultural systems, systems of innovation and adaptation, and learning under fire. The American system was not perfect. It made terrible mistakes and suffered terrible losses. But it learned from those mistakes faster than its enemies could exploit them. It turned defeats into lessons, and lessons into adaptations, and adaptations into advantages. The hedgerow cutters were one small example of that larger process, a process that transformed American forces from the inexperienced army that landed on Omaha Beach into the efficient killing machine that crossed the Rhine less than a year later, on still summer evenings in Normandy. When the light falls golden across the hedgerows and the fields lie peaceful under clear skies, it is difficult to imagine what happened there. The killing grounds are quiet now. The Tiger tanks are gone. The steel prongs were scrapped generations ago, but the hedgerows remain, thick and green and ancient, holding in their roots the memory of the summer when American soldiers taught them to yield. And in that teaching, in that moment when Curtis Coulin's improvised solution broke the stalemate and opened the road to victory, lay a truth about freedom and innovation that transcended tactics and strategy. The truth was simple but profound. Systems that trust individuals to think create advantages that rigid hierarchies cannot match. Democracy's strength in war comes not from superior virtue, but from superior adaptability, from the cultural permission to question and experiment and fail and try again. The Tiger tank was beaten by a wire loop trick, but it was really beaten by an idea. The idea that solutions can come from anywhere, that authority is not required for innovation, that a sergeant from Kentucky can change the course of a campaign because his society taught him that problems exist to be solved rather than endured. That idea, welded onto the front of a Sherman tank, proved more powerful than the finest engineering Nazi Germany could produce. And the idea survived long after the tanks were gone, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned that adaptation beats perfection, that speed beats power, that thinking beats conformity. The hedgerow cutters became legend not for what they destroyed, but for what they represented. The moment when American ingenuity turned German strength into German weakness, when improvisation defeated sophistication, when one man's creativity multiplied across an army changed everything. The steel glinted in the Norman sun, cutting through roots, through earth, through the myth of invincibility, opening a path that led from the beaches to Berlin, from defeat to victory, from the question of whether democracy could fight to the answer written in blood and steel, and the strange grace of solutions born from freedom.